Hello everyone, welcome back to the TAPED podcast, the most microtonal podcast in the world. We are your hosts as always, myself MickyT.
And me, Nostalgia.
And welcome to the February recap, where we basically go over a bunch of noteworthy releases of the month of February and just basically give our own reviews on them, give our own thoughts and opinions. And, you know, February was surprisingly stacked for releases, so I'm excited to get through this one. There's some pretty big ones that I want to get my thoughts on, especially the ones that came out on the last Friday that we're recording this on. Jesus, that day was stacked.
I will preface this. I'm not gonna lie. There has been some big releases, but quality-wise, it's been kind of mid. It hasn't been anything awful or amazing, bar a few things. So, I like given.
Sorry, go ahead.
My 5 and 6 out of 10 ratio is definitely a lot higher this month, but there has been some highlights.
I've had a fair amount of good albums that I enjoyed, but you know,
yeah, I was just looking through it, and I wanted to give everyone a warning.
Yeah, there was one album in particular that I just thought was an absolute stinker, but we'll get to it soon. And I think with that in mind, we'll just I think we'll just get right into it. We'll start with the first album that we're going to be talking about today, which is Medicine at Midnight by the Foo Fighters. And this is the 10th studio album from Dave Grohl and the lads, and I did a video review for this album already, so if you want to go have a look at that, then, you know, go ahead. So I'll keep my thoughts a little bit brief, as brief as I can. I see the Foo Fighters as a singles band rather than an album band. You know, they have good songs, but some of my favourite Foo Fighters songs have been their singles. But, you know, the singles for this album in particular just weren't very good. So I was honestly dreading this album. And, you know, now that it's out and I've had time to digest it, I don't think Medicine at Midnight is a awful album by any means. I just think it's incredibly mediocre. Honestly, it might be my least favourite Foo Fighters album. You know, like I said, not that it's a terrible album, but it's just easily the weakest crop of tracks that the band had offered us in an album format thus far, and I'm not looking for anything overcomplicated from them, just some good rock tunes that feel fresh, well-produced and catchy, and, you know, possibly explore new ideas. And I can only really give Medicine at Midnight credit for doing two of those things, as, you know, the production, you know, it's fine for mainstream rock standards, and there are hooks in the album that are catchy, and, you know, they do kind of experiment sometimes, but I don't know, most of it is just leaving a lot to be desired, you know, like some tracks like Shame Shame and Chasing Birds, like, you know, they do have some new ideas in there, but these tracks are just either incredibly bland or they just lack any form of substantive qualities, or they're just straight up a mess, like the song No Son of Mine. It just sounds like a shit Motorhead song, honestly. You know, the rest of the album, you know, it's just your standard Foo Fighters affair with arena rock and alternative rock's pastiche, but it has more of a poppy twist, a lot of which is just, I don't know, kind of redundant from a lot of stuff that we've heard from them in the band's discography, and it just gets tiring with average dad rock track after average dad rock track. And, you know, I respect Dave Grohl, but this album wasn't it for me.
Yeah, no, I agree with the sentiment that, you know, Foo Fighters have some great singles. They've released some great singles throughout the years, but, you know, their album discography is pretty inconsistent. And, you know, Medicine at Midnight really doesn't do anything to convince me otherwise. It's seldom downright awful, but a lot of this album is just a collection of very insignificant alternative rock tracks that, you know, were obviously made for an arena full of people and casual listeners rather than, you know, cynical music nerds. And, you know, I do respect that, I do acknowledge that, but still, you know, there's nothing like they can still make an album with substance while, you know, still keeping it very much, you know, in that range, in that arena rock, dad rock range where it appeals to the casual listener. Wasting Light is a great example of that. That album was very fulfilling. The album had some amazing tracks. It was pretty well paced. It was pretty consistent, but it's still, you know, it was generally quite an accessible album. And, you know, it was also released quite late into their discography, so, you know, I still believe that they can make some decent projects. I don't count them off completely, but, you know, it's hard not to go into an album like this, at least a little bit cynical. And, you know, while, again, it's not bad, it has some decent ideas, it's just really boring. It's the pop tropes like present throughout just don't add anything to the music. It's just not very interesting at all. And as much as I love Dave Grohl as a person and as a musician, you know, his output with the Foo Fighters has definitely not been the highlight of his career for a lot of it.
Yeah, I agree. I think the best tracks on Medicine at Midnight are Waiting on a War and Chasing Birds. The worst tracks are No Son of Mine, Making a Fire, Cloud Spotter, and Medicine at Midnight, and I gave this album a strong 4.
My favourite tracks were Waiting on a War, Love Dies Young. My least favourite tracks were Shame Shame and Cloud Spotter, and I gave this album a decent 4 out of 10.
Alright, next we have For the First Time by Black Country New Road. And this is the debut studio album from the UK experimental rock band Black Country New Road. And, you know, when I first heard this album, you know, I had to sit with it for almost a week after I heard it, as I wasn't really sure, like, what to make of this album based off of my first listens. Like, I liked it, but I found it difficult to explain why I liked it. There was definitely something there that drew me to the tracks, but I just couldn't figure out what that was for the life of me. And, you know, after a week of listening to it, I did eventually get an answer, and, you know, I think For the First Time is great because, you know, it's refreshing, and I don't just like it, I love it. And I even ended up getting a vinyl copy of it there about a week ago, and it's so sleek, I love it. You know, and, you know, I'm sure, like, lots of people have been keeping up with, like, the EU post-punk scene, then you'd know that a lot of releases from the genre have been quite frequent. Like, in January alone, we got albums from Shame and Viagra Boys, and while I like some of these releases, there wasn't really much about them that make them stand out in the already saturated wave of post-punk. So you can imagine, you know, I'd be getting tired of it, even though post-punk is a genre that I love. You know, then on comes Black Country New Road to put a fresh spin on things, and makes possibly one of the best debut albums in a very long time. You know, from a sound perspective, Black Country New Road gets so much right on this album. The production is excellent, the compositions are interesting, the tracks are just fleshed out to their full potential, all while remaining both gratifying and eclectic. The album finds a perfect balance between just being crushing with its abrasive post-rock dynamics, you know, on instrumental, Sunglasses, and Science Fair, and at times just serene in its slower moments, like some parts of Opus, and especially on track X. And I love their spin on post-punk, but it leans more into, like, kind of the post-rock and klezmer influences, which is a pretty odd pairing, but it's done so well on here. You know, frontman Isaac Wood is another part of the album that intrigues me. His very, like, shaky and often manic vocal delivery adds a whole other bit of unease to the chaos to these tracks, and the lyrics are another thing too. They're pretty intriguing, to say the least. Some of them make absolutely no sense, especially with the random references, but there's moments of gold in terms of lyrics, like on Sunglasses or on Science Fair. You know, the band, you know, they do wear their influences on their sleeves. Like, you can definitely hear some Slint, Black Midi, and Swans, but I feel like the band does manage to stray away from being, you know, a rip-off, but by putting their own spin on things, and, you know, all while making it gratifying. Yeah, I'm waffling on for a bit much. I just love this album. All you need to do is know that. I love the track list. We're only in the second month of the year, and we already have an Album of the Year contender. And, yeah, great album, to say the least.
Yeah, I did a video review of this on my channel. I'll keep it brief, just like you did with Foo Fighters. Yeah, no, I love post-punk. I love everything about the genre. But I do agree. We were talking about this on last month's recap. It has been feeling quite oversaturated with bands that don't really add anything new to the equation. And, you know, it only took a few weeks. Like, it was literally the next week. This was the next week after we recorded that video, this was released, and we I guess we both take that back now, because there definitely is a new band in town that is bringing a lot to the table, and, you know, bringing on their own twist and their own just take on this genre. And, you know, Black Country New Road is genuinely one of the most exciting bands I've heard in the last few years, not just this year. And, you know, as you said, this is definitely the best debut album I've heard in a while. I'd say the last time I heard something this good as a band's debut album, it was, funnily enough, it was probably Black Midi with Schlagenheim.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, this project is amazing. It definitely, you know, the influences are clear. You can definitely hear them, but it doesn't, you know, wear them out, or it doesn't sound boring or repetitive, or redundant at any point. It sounds completely new and fresh, and all of these different genres and different ideas and different sounds coming together just sounds truly quite idiosyncratic. It just doesn't fall into the same category as some of the albums you mentioned, like the Viagra Boys album, which it was fine, but it didn't do anything interesting. It was just quite redundant and boring if you think about it in the grand scheme of the genre. And this is just such a breath of fresh air for post-punk and music as a whole, and it's an incredible album. It's definitely one of the best albums I've heard in a long time, and it's my first 9 out of 10 of the year, and it's definitely going to be an album of the year contender. Again, early on in the year, but it's definitely going up there.
Geez, spoilers for the score. Oh my.
Well, here.
Oh, no, it's fine.
Well, I'm sure everyone would have been surprised if I gave it anything less.
I mean, yeah, fair. Alright, so my favourite tracks from For the First Time are track X, Athens, France, Instrumental, and Science Fair. I have no least favourite tracks, and I gave this album a strong 9.
My favourite tracks were Instrumental, Athens, France, Science Fair, Sunglasses, track X, and Opus. And just like you, I have no least favourite tracks. I gave this album a light 9 out of 10.
Nice. Alright, next we have Flowers for Vases, Descansos, I hope I'm saying that right, by Hayley Williams.
Probably.
I hope so. This is the sophomore solo album from singer-songwriter and frontwoman of Paramore, Hayley Williams. And Hayley follows up her debut solo album, Petals for Armour, with this new one, Flowers for Vases, not even a year after her debut, and we both covered it on the podcast twice, I believe, and from my understanding, we both enjoyed the record. I enjoyed the album more so for its, production choices and the songwriting. I feel like Hayley was really fleshing herself out as a more mature songwriter, and she's still doing so on this album. But as a whole, I much prefer Petals for Armour, but that doesn't take away much from Flowers for Vases, because on its own, it's a solid album, but a flawed one. Starting with some positives, there's plenty of great songwriting moments on this album. Specifically, one I'll mention is for the track Trigger. I think that Hayley vocally is pretty good, which is a given. She never disappoints on that front, and the album is pleasant sounding, but as a whole, the main issue I have is that the production is not as interesting as it was on Petals for Armour. I think a lot of the bare sound palette on this album just lacks the intricacies and interesting sounds that made Petals for Armour a good listen. A lot of the sound palette just has no flavour to it. It's very bare, and it honestly gets dull and unmemorable. Nothing bad by any means, but it's just not that interesting. I can respect the more raw and intimate approach, but ultimately it just doesn't really do much for me. And if I was ever to listen to some of Hayley's work, I'd take pretty much anything from Petals for Armour over this.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. This project is definitely a deviation from the very synth-heavy alternative dance found on Petals for Armour. It instead sees her take on a more intimate and stripped-back indie folk approach. And, that isn't entirely unexpected, considering late last year she released a Petals for Armour Self-Serenades EP, which is basically a few tracks and one unique track, new track from Petals for Armour, just re-recorded in a very similar style to what's heard on Flowers for Vases. It's nice, it's a pleasant sound, but honestly it's a little derivative, and it just doesn't strike me as anything exciting. I really love the charisma and the energy and the flow of Petals for Armour, and the album has seriously grown on me since we covered it in the recap. I think in the recap I had it at a 6, but as the year went on, it made my top 50 albums of the year. It grew up to, I boosted it up to a strong 7, and it's one of the most exciting and fun things she's done, including stuff with Paramore. And to see it followed up by something that's on the opposite, very unexciting and very just bland and monotonous. It's not a bad album, and I do think there are some moments where the stripped back approach is definitely carried by Hayley's vocals and like a lot of the atmospheric aspects of the music, but there is also tracks where the vocals don't really strike me as anything spectacular. The instrumental just kind of is a little too skeletal and uninteresting, and overall the track just kind of loses me. and moments like that are just a little too frequent.
Yeah, fair enough. My favourite tracks from Flowers for Vases are Trigger and Inordinary. My least favourite tracks are My Limb and Wait On, and I gave this album a decent 6.
My favourite tracks were First Thing to Go, Trigger, Wait On, and Inordinary. My least favourite track was No Use I Just Do, and I gave this album a light 6 out of 10.
Alright, next we have Ignorance by The Weather Station, and this is the 5th studio album from the Toronto Chamber Pop Act. And I'm not very familiar with a lot of The Weather Station's music. I wasn't really sure as to what this band or project is about, or what sounds they would delve into. And to be fair, I wasn't really that disappointed with Ignorance, as it's a very solid album. In terms of sound, the Weather Station go into like a sophistopop and chamber pop setting, and it's good for what it is. The production is really good on this album. There's a great attention to detail and the intricacies of the sound. The sound as a whole is really clean, and while at the same time sounding really pretty. The drums do sound a little flat, but they work with some of the soundscapes, and there's plenty of standout moments on the instrumental front especially the opening tracks, I should say. In terms of songwriting, Tamara Lindemann does a great job. While she isn't a standout vocalist, I like what she does and how she matched the soundscapes, and she had plenty of standout moments of songwriting for tracks like Robber, Separated, Trust, and Tried to Tell You. And for its 10 tracks, it's consistent enough. But while a lot of the sophistopop material on this album is decent, it ultimately doesn't have that extra push to make it great or stand out. It's a pretty good album on its own, don't get me wrong, but it's nothing special, and I'd say I'll probably have forgotten about it in the next few weeks.
There is a pattern with albums this month. I don't know if you agree, but for me personally, a lot of albums have definitely peaked at the front for like first half and then kind of dropped off when it comes to the second half, and this is the first of those albums. The first 4 tracks are just amazing. They're really sophisticated and lush and vibrant and emotive, and they have this kind of rhythmic and like just vibrant and colorful atmosphere throughout. The very, what's the word, just somber and like melancholy backbone of the track is just I'll rephrase this. It has a very melancholic and somber backbone, but it's just there's some like vibrancy and color and rhythm and just excitement sprinkled throughout those tracks. They're really exciting, and it sets up a very interesting pace for the album. But then as the album goes on, a lot of those exciting moments just kind of fade, and the more somber and just melancholy moments take over, and the songs just become a little monotonous, and the excitement just kind of fades, and the flow of the album just kind of drops off. It's never bad. I still really enjoy a lot of what is present on the second half of the album, but it's just when the first 4 tracks are as strong as they are, it really I guess it's a tough act to follow, but it just doesn't really live up to the expectations the album sets for itself early on. I do wish there was a little more to do with a little more like meat on the bones when it comes to the instrumentation. I wish there was a little more unique soundscapes and just different ideas present, because a lot of it just kind of plays the same cards throughout. And the album, it's a very good album, but I still there's definitely room to complain with the pacing, at least.
Fair enough. Okay, my favourite tracks from Ignorance are Robber, Atlantic, Tried to Tell You, Parking Lot, Separated, and Trust. My least favourite track is Heart, and I gave this album a decent 7.
My favourite tracks were Robber, Atlantic, Tried to Tell You, and Parking Lot. Also Subdivisions, and my least favourite track was Trust, and I gave this album a light 7 out of 10. A very light 7.
Okay, next we have The Things They Believe by Loathe. This is the sophomore album from the Liverpool alternative metal and metalcore band Loathe, and they're following up their debut, I Let It In and It Took Every... No, not their debut, is it their... No, I think it was their debut,
I don't see that.
Anyway, they're following up I Let It In and It Took Everything, which was a blistering metalcore and shoegaze album that I absolutely adored when I first heard it, and I still do to this day. And they're following up literally a year after that record with a new one, and with this one I was pretty curious as to where Loathe could go, and they went in a different direction, alright? And it's just straight up ambient album. And while I think that going in this direction was respectable, I ultimately came away kind of disappointed. I think its moments are pretty good. Some of them are pretty fantastic, but ultimately it doesn't really captivate me, and it just comes off like ambient pastiche without much in the way of any inventive or creative moments. Sure, it's dense and pretty in its atmospheres, and it's an admirable left turn from what I expected from them, but I don't really see myself coming back to this one that often.
Yeah, I mean, I was also a fan of their previous album for a lot of the same reasons you mentioned, but I do appreciate the approach on this new project. As you said, it explores a very dark ambient and drone approach, like aesthetic, which completely out of left field and completely unexpected. But the album executes the band executes it very well, and it definitely makes for some very haunting and mesmerizing moments. But as a whole project, it just kind of drags, and there's places where the drone just isn't that entrancing and just feels a bit awkward. The drones kind of seem a little stretched out in places, and I'm not sure if this is a one-off endeavor for the group, but I certainly think there's some potential for some great ambient drone music here, and I can't really say that my expectations are met here. I do think there's a little bit of fluff and filler in between some of the better moments on this album, but tracks like Don't Get Hurt or The Rain Outside for sure definitely make me believe that this is something that the band can seriously do and pull off really well. For the time being though, this is what we get, and it's good, but it's just not great.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, my favorite tracks from The Things They Believe are Love in Real Time and Keep Fighting the Good Fight. My least favourite track was Perpetual Sunday Evening, and I gave this album a decent 6.
My favourite tracks were Don't Get Hurt, Love on Real Time, Remember, and The Rain Outside. My least favourite tracks were Black Marble and Keep On Fighting the Good Fight, and I gave this album a decent 6.
Alright, next we have a pretty big one. We have TYRON by Slowthai. This is the sophomore album from one of the most prominent UK rappers right now, Slowthai, and TYRON follows up Slowthai's great breakout album, 2019's Nothing Great About Britain, which was one of my favourite hip-hop records of 2019, a record that got me into Slowthai, and a moment that I continue to celebrate as a seminal moment in UK hip-hop. I've done a review for TYRON already on my own channel, so if you want to go see my thoughts on that, then check that out. I'm going to, once again, keep my thoughts brief. I think TYRON sees Slowthai opt for a more commercial and clean sound, and while that may turn a few listeners off, it works for me personally, as the production is consistently fantastic, often infectious, catchy, and particularly on the second half, heartwarming. I like how it offers us a more introspective side and a more vulnerable side to who TYRON is, hence why it's self-titled, and it offers more of a vulnerable side to, what we know as the misfit rapper on the surface. The album is split into two sides, which have their own distinct sound. The first half is more in the infectious banger territory, and the second half is in the more intricate and serious side. Personally, I think the second half of the album is a little bit better, but that doesn't take away from the first half, which goes so hard. Slowthai himself is performing very well with some consistently solid bars, interesting inflections, flows. His lyrics are a lot more personal this time, and he picks great features that do add to the tracks, but there were some features I was just extremely underwhelmed by. This is no sophomore slump from Slowthai. You can watch my video if you want to hear me go in depth on every track on this thing, but all you need to know is I think this album is really great. I think it's a great follow-up to Nothing Great About Britain, and it's a great moment for Slowthai.
Yeah, again, I also made a review of this on my own channel, and so I'll also keep my ramblings quite brief. I think that on this project, Slowthai again proves that he's one of the most exciting artists around, especially in the hip hop genre, especially coming out of the UK. This album isn't an incredibly huge deviation from what he delivered on Nothing Great About Britain. It's definitely a lot more trap oriented, and it's definitely, especially on the second disc, a lot more introspective and personal. While obviously his debut still had moments like Northampton Child, a lot of what that album means to a lot of people, and a lot of what the album, is about is just this angry, frustrated, just unrelenting, attitude that Slowthai portrays. And a lot of that attitude is still present, especially in the first half. And, it definitely seems like, obviously this was intentional by the use of caps on the tracks in the first half and then lowercase on the second half. The first half is definitely a lot more hard hitting. It's definitely got a lot more bangers. And then the second half is a lot more introspective and a lot more poignant and a lot more mellow. And both halves surprisingly don't, feel disjointed. They do flow well into one another. The album is very enjoyable throughout. I know a lot of people prefer the second half. I'm kind of torn. There's definitely some serious highlights on both for me, and there's definitely some highlights in Slowthai's discography overall present here. And it's a great project overall.
Alright, my favourite tracks from TYRON are Cancelled, Mazza, Vex, Play With Fire, I Tried, Terms, Focus, Push, Feel Away, and ADHD. My least favourite tracks are What, Dead, and NHS, and I gave this album a light 8.
My favourite tracks were 4-5 Smoke, Cancelled, Mazza, Vex, Dead, I Tried, Focus, Push, NHS, Feel Away, and ADHD. My least favourite track was Terms, and I gave this album a decent 8 out of 10.
Ooh, Terms and least favourites, really?
Don't fuck with the hook at all.
I like Dominic Fike's hook, honestly. The only thing that disappointed me about that song was just a lack of a Denzel Curry on a track that's supposed to feature Denzel Curry. No, I have nothing against
Dominic Fike. I just that hook, ain't it, Chief?
I'm gonna have to disagree with you, homie.
Fair enough.
Alright, next we have Glowing in the Dark by Django. And this is the 4th studio album from the UK indie pop, indie electronica and neo-psych band. Now this is the first album I'm ever hearing from this group. I've never heard anything from them prior, and like every album, I just go into every album hoping that they leave a good impression on me. But honestly, Django doesn't really do that for me, unfortunately, and as a whole, I felt like Glowing in the Dark was pretty mediocre. While Django doesn't make a bad album with Glowing in the Dark, it's far too bland to be anything other than average at best. I think I can appreciate that there's lots of styles and ideas going on through the music, but many of the sonic ideas that the band explore on here often get rendered quite tepid because of how mild and bland the sound palette is. The production isn't very interesting, the mixes feel way too clean and sterile, and the vocals are just straight up boring. Does Glowing in the Dark have its moments? Yeah, absolutely. I'll get to that in best tracks, but those moments are just few and far in between for me. I got nothing else to say here.
Yeah, honestly, I completely forgot to I even listened to this album. I must have listened to it at night or something, but I went back into it like a few days ago, and I was like, oh yeah, no, I listened to this. That's like the first time that has ever happened to me. And, I can see why this album is so just unmemorable and so derivative of stuff they've already done, that there's nothing really that's stand out about this project. It has some good tracks, but they're scattered throughout, and again, most of them are in the first half of this album. This is another one of those albums where the second half is just so underwhelming and uninteresting and almost non-existent to me that this whole album just becomes a bit blurry. But after revisiting it and making sure that I'm not just fucking sleeping through it every time, it is definitely derivative of a lot of their previous projects. It doesn't really do anything new for the band. It doesn't do anything new for the genre. It just kind of exists. Especially the second half of this album, it just kind of happens.
Alright, my favourite tracks from Glowing in the Dark are Spirals, Night of the Buffalo, and Kick the Devil Out. My least favourite tracks are The Ark, Free from Gravity, and Glowing in the Dark, and I gave this album a strong 4.
My favourite tracks were Spirals, Right the Wrongs, Got Me Worried, Waking Up, Head Rush. My least favourite tracks were Free from Gravity, The Ark, The World Will Turn, and Glowing in the Dark, and I gave this album a light 5 out of 10.
Alright, next we have Super Monster by Claud. This is the full-length debut album from the New York singer-songwriter and Satisfactory signee, Claud, and Also, I think this album is actually the first release under Satisfactory, and I'm sure I'm not alone here in not really finding out about Claud until, this album was announced and when they were signed to Phoebe Bridgers' label, Satisfactory. I didn't get to hear any of the singles for this album, but I've heard good things, so I had high expectations for this album, and for what it is, I think Super Monster is really solid. Granted, it doesn't really stand out in the huge sea of indie pop and bedroom pop albums. I often feel like the ideas that Claud explores on this album were probably executed much better beforehand, and I think that, it's not overly consistent. But besides that, I think that there's plenty of standout moments in the track list, some very fun, bouncy indie pop tracks that feature some great vocals and songwriting. While the songwriting isn't mind-blowing or anything, it sure has its thoughtful moments, and as a whole, the album's production sounds pretty good, especially on the absolute best tracks. Now, there's definitely potential here, and I hope that, Claud reaches that potential, but as a whole, Super Monster is just a good foundation for them to start.
Yeah, Super Monster is definitely, not that unique, especially when you look at the grand scheme of bedroom pop and some of the leading artists in the genre like Clairo, Girl in Red, or Gus Dapperton. All of these artists definitely come to mind when you listen to Claud, and while, obviously that's not a bad thing by default, bedroom pop can still be a vibrant and enjoyable and charming genre. Super Monster does prove that at times, but at others it just sounds very sloppy and very directionless, and it's just incredibly derivative of, songs that I've already heard in the genre from albums like from artists like Clairo and Gus Dapperton, like I mentioned. But again, the first half of this album is genuinely really strong. Tracks like Gold or Soft Spot are really infectious and memorable. Claud has some very interesting performances. They have some great lyricism. It's pop-wise, at least, it's just very memorable and catchy overall. And, on the flip side, there are moments, especially on the latter half, that just kind of sound like, something you'd hear a million times over if you look up just some random bedroom pop compilation on Spotify. They don't really have a very memorable hook. They don't have anything about them that stands out and shines like some of the better tracks do. Overall, it's still an enjoyable album for sure, but it kind of just does what a lot of bedroom pop does and just play to its tropes.
Yeah. My favorite tracks from Super Monster are Soft Spot, In or In Between, Cuff Your Jeans, and Anna. My least favorite track was Falling with the Rain, and I gave this album a decent 6.
My favorite tracks were Overnight, Gold, Soft Spot, Falling with the Rain. My least favorite track was In or In Between, and I gave this album a light 6.
Next, we have Who Am I by Pale Waves, and this is the sophomore album from the UK pop rock band, and Who Am I tries what a lot of other artists in recent memory have been doing, and attempts to bring a nostalgic sound to the modern music landscape, but it just lacks in many ways. Pale Waves attempt to bring the mid-2000s into the early 2020s with pop rock influences from the likes of, like, say, Avril Lavigne and, to some degree Paramore, but where other artists added their own spin, fresh ideas, and great performances, Pale Waves kind of boils it down to being very derivative and a bland piece of pop rock pastiche. I can respect plenty of the songwriting moments, and I can certainly get the appeal, but a lot of the material on this thing is just weak to me. The production is often quite standard, pretty sterile, lacks that extra oomph. The vocals are quite often derivative, and the sound palette as a whole just seems incredibly dated. Tracks like Change and She's My Religion are highlights for sure, but unfortunately this album is just very short of those highlights, and I don't really see where this band could go next, but I do hope that they prove me wrong.
Yeah, I mean, I've never really disliked Pale Waves, and they've always come through with some great tracks, but again, album-wise, this project is just so full of filler and so full of tracks that are so inoffensive and squeaky clean, and wear their influences on their sleeves so much that it becomes hard to sit through and not get bored of. I've enjoyed the group on a casual level, and they've got some really charming tracks, but, this album just doesn't really prove anything other than the fact that they're just a band who like to play with very retro and tropes that were present in music in yesteryear, and they don't do anything new. They kind of sound like, it just kind of sounds like a collection of this kind of nostalgic synthy pop rock that's kind of taking over right now. It just sounds kind of like a compilation of tropes in that genre. It does have its moments, but overall it's a very boring and derivative project.
Alright, best tracks on Who Am I are She's My Religion, Change and Tomorrow. My least favourite tracks are Run To and Who Am I, and I gave this album a strong 4.
My favourite tracks were She's My Religion, Wish You Were Here and Tomorrow. My least favourite tracks were Change and You Don't Own Me, and I give this album a light 5 out of 10.
Next we have As the Love Continues by Mogwai, and this is the 10th studio album from the Scottish post-rock band, and once again, I'm not familiar with this group at all, so once again, this is a new band for me, and, this is my first impressions of them, and, As the Love Continues is actually quite solid, but as a whole, it isn't anything that interesting as a whole. A lot of the material on this album is mostly instrumental and pretty good, and it does have some qualities that I admire, like the shoegazy soundscapes of the production, the synthetic yet somewhat organic post-rock sounds, and there's some amazing tracks in songs like Midnight Flip, which is honestly amazing. Besides that, the sound of the instrumentals just kind of blend together. They don't really stand out to me, and overall I feel like it lacks in being a creative piece, and it isn't really doing anything that creative or dynamic. It has its moments, and it's mostly really solid, but it just lacks that creative and interesting push to make it stand out to me. And, that analogy you were on about earlier, like, the second half is just really fucking boring. Just no other way to say it.
Yeah.
Except for that one highlight I mentioned. So yeah, that's about it.
I've never really been too keen on Mogwai's music. I've always appreciated it, and as you said, it's solid. It always has been solid, and even on As the Love Continues, it's definitely solid. But there's nothing here that's really selling me. I think it's definitely a pleasant album. And it's definitely a grand album in its, compositions, but it's just not really engaging. It kind of, at times, feels like background noise. It's pleasant, but the mixing also just feels very washed out and kind of muddy. It feels again like just an insignificant collection of tracks that just definitely set a nice atmosphere and have a nice pace to them. They're definitely solid instrumentally and compositionally, but in the grand scheme of things, there's nothing about them that gives them any oomph. There's nothing about them that's particularly memorable or exciting. It's kind of Mogwai just doing their thing again. And, if you're a fan of what they've been doing, there's definitely no room to complain. But as someone who has been kind of lukewarm on the band, again, I'm very lukewarm on this project.
Alright, my favourite tracks from As the Love Continues are Midnight Flit, which is genuinely an amazing song, might I add. To the Bin, My Friend, Tonight We Vacate the Earth, and Richie Sacramento. My least favourite tracks are Fuck Off Money and Pat Stains, and I gave this album a decent 6.
My favourite tracks were Here We Go Forever, Richie Sacramento, and Sailing Granny. My least favourite track was Pat Stains, and I gave this album a light 6 out of 10.
Alright, next we have another big one. We have LW by King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. And this is the 17th studio album from one of rock's most exciting bands, King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard.
You'd think they've been around since like the 70s.
Literally, you'd think they'd been fucking jamming with Frank Zappa, but no, here they are. So, yeah, this is the, like I said, 17th studio album from King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard, and once again, we both have done video reviews on this album in particular, so once again, thoughts are going to be a little brief. The band are well known for changing up their sound, that it's hard to really figure out what they could do next, but with that in mind, King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard have been just sticking with the same sound for these last two albums, kind of exploring a kind of certain sound on KG and this one, which they both act as like successors to Flying Microtonal Banana, which is one of my favorite King Giz albums, but despite it having interesting experiments and moments that I really liked, it pales in comparison with that album in particular, because as a whole, it's just not as exciting or as interesting as the album that precedes it. Both those albums, actually. You know, much like KG, LW suffers from being a weak attempt at recreating the magic that we heard from the band's, 2017 album Flying Microtonal Banana. But while KG was a pretty good album, LW is decent at best. Many of the ideas that the band explore on this album are pretty redundant, often tedious, and just for lack of better words, just straight up boring. There's only a few moments where it's actually exciting, like on one of my favorite tracks from King Giz in general, KGLW, which is just a straight up progressive metal track that is genuinely amazing. Besides that, the other tracks in the album are just alright. They're not really that special. They're just really forgettable. I haven't really been as disappointed with an album as I was with this one for a long time, but alas, here we are. This ain't it, unfortunately. I'm sorry, King Giz. I love you, but this ain't it.
Yeah, no, as you said, King Gizzard again returned to microtonality and again returned to a sound they've already explored on 2 occasions now, and it's good. It's definitely solid. It's consistent, but a lot of what makes King Gizzard so special is just how exciting every new release is, and the excitement is just kind of lost when you kind of know what they're gonna do, and you have this expectation going into it. And yeah, no, the expectation is there. It matches the expectation, but the expectation itself was never anything other than, that was more of the same. Cool. They did it well. Again. And, that's all this album really does. It does have some great moments, it has some great tracks, but overall it's never going to reach the excitement that Flying Microtonal Banana managed, because Flying Microtonal Banana was the first time they've ever done anything like this. And on top of that, I'm not gonna pretend, and if you were to listen to all of these albums separately, I'm not gonna pretend like they're all on the same level as Flying Microtonal Banana. I do think the sound is generally way better executed on that project. And even KG had tracks like Intrasport, which is one of the best songs they've ever released in my opinion. It's such a weird and goofy and fun and exciting and just completely unexpected track, that it stood as a highlight on KG for me. And while this album LW is a little more consistent than KG, as it doesn't really have any bad tracks, it is just also a little less exciting. I don't know which I prefer out of the two. It's hard to say. I think KG definitely has higher highs, but also it definitely has lower lows, so I'd say they're pretty much on par.
I feel like I'm in the minority on Intrasport because I really don't like that song.
Really?
Yeah, I think it's fucking cursed.
So fucking cool.
It's so fucking cursed.
I love it so much. I love the music video as well.
The music video is funny, but I think the synths just sound like shit on that song. Honestly, it's not my thing.
Well, to each their own. It's one of my favorite King Gizzard tracks.
Fair, I guess. Yeah. With that being said, my favorite tracks from LW are KGLW and 1, and my least favorite tracks are Static Electricity, East West Link, and See Me. And I gave this album a light 6.
My favorite tracks on LW were If Not Now Then When, 1, Supreme, Ascendancy, and KGLW, and my least favorite track was See Me, and I gave this album a decent 6 out of 10.
Next we have Carnage by Nick Cave and Warren Ellis, and this is the later... what the fuck? This is the latest collaborative effort from producer Warren Ellis and Australian singer-songwriter Nick Cave, formerly of Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds fame. Sorry about that at the start. I just fucking died there for a second.
It's fine.
Now, I only got to dive into a bunch of Nick Cave's discography recently, and everything I've heard up to this point has been very good, and I've thoroughly enjoyed a lot of his stuff. And, out of nowhere, Nick Cave and Warren Ellis just dropped this new album, Carnage, just out of the blue, which was quite the surprise, but after giving it a listen, it was a very pleasant surprise for me, to say the least. I didn't really expect to really mess with this album all that much as I do, but after listening to it's a few more times, I really love this album. I think it's great. it is Nick Cave just doing his thing over production that has more of an art and like chamber pop centered direction alongside some often sparse sounds that border on ambient, and there's some moments in the production that are just very emotive, sometimes dark, oftentimes just very beautiful, but at the same time it has this kind of cold, synthetic yet kind of organic feel, and it just works very well for Nick Cave's style of vocals, and the songwriting is just stellar for a lot of these tracks, especially for tracks like Balcony Man and White Elephant. Nick's powerful vocals are fantastic. I always love his presence on any song that I've heard him on, and it's no different throughout this entire album. And, his lyrics once again are fantastic, and he makes the experience all the more great. I suppose the only complaints that I have for Carnage is that, it won't be the thing that Nick Cave will be remembered for. There's other Nick Cave albums that will outshine this one consistently, and there's maybe one track that I don't care for, but besides that, I loved a lot of what I was hearing on this album, and a potential Song of the Month is on this album as well, so there's that. And yeah, I like Carnage.
Nick Cave and Warren Ellis, obviously frequent collaborators throughout their careers, and they're kind of Cave's first proper release since Ghosteen. Was definitely an exciting prospect. Ghosteen was a very good album, and while everyone is seemingly very excited and happy with how this project ended up, I am a little lukewarm on it, if I'm being honest. I do think it's a good project, and I definitely enjoyed Ghosteen, and this project definitely carries a lot of what Nick Cave has done throughout his career, especially in his later years. It's very skeletal yet ethereal and introspective, and it carries a very melancholic and dreary yet poignant beauty throughout. And Carnage definitely excels at moments, and the sound is definitely really well executed again at moments. But there are some tracks on here where the purposely lethargic nature of the track just kind of becomes a slog for me. And while some of Cave's songwriting and delivery is certainly strong enough to carry the album on its own, there's also moments where it feels a little directionless and a little sloppy and repetitive. Overall, I still get definitely a lot more highlights than low points, and it's not a jab at Nick Cave, who's one of the most respected and adored artists of all time, and I definitely do love me some Nick Cave. This just isn't really one of his highlights. It's not going to go down as one of his highlights for me. It's not that exciting for me, and while the highlights are there, overall it's a little sloppy.
How sad. It's fine, whatever. My favorite podcast over. I'm leaving. We're never making another episode again. Fuck you. Yeah, my favorite tracks from Carnage are Albuquerque, Balcony Man, Shattered Ground, Carnage, and White Elephant. My least favorite track is Old Time, and I gave this album a light 8.
My favorite tracks, if my notes would open up again because they're after crashing, were White Elephant, Albuquerque, and Balcony Man, and my least favorite track was Hand of God, and I give this album a light 6 out of 10.
Alright, next we have Little Oblivions by Julien Baker. And this is the third studio album from the Tennessee singer-songwriter, and I only found out about Julien Baker's music about a month ago, I think, when I first heard one of the teaser tracks for this album, which I thought was a pretty good single, but besides that, I didn't hear much else from her. All I knew was that this album was coming around the corner, and I was curious to see what the buzz was about for this album, and I do in fact get the buzz for this album, because in layman's terms, it's pretty fucking great. While there isn't much about Little Oblivions that's inventive for the indie singer-songwriter scene, it thrives in being a grand, powerful, and emotionally potent exploration of the human condition, and it has many aspects to it that make it a very enjoyable listen. For one, the production on this album is great. A lot of the instrumentation, while at times a little overbearing, is very large and often grand in its melancholy. It suits what Julien is doing on this album, and that's another aspect I love about this album. Julien herself, as her performances on this album are fantastic, with very, very few moments where she underwhelms me. I love her haunting vocal delivery, which adds some potency to the lyrical themes, which are often quite dark and sometimes relatable. They carry a lot of emotional baggage and moments of catharsis that add to the sound of this record by just creating pure bliss and a cathartic bliss. I'm just here for it, and when the small nitpicks and grievances that I have for some of these tracks like do not occur, I am just having a great time. I think this album is fantastic as a whole.
Yeah, I mean, I first discovered Julien's music in 2017 with her previous album, Turn Out the Lights. It's been almost 4 years since her last release, and what a long wait it has been, but, you know, I'm really happy and ecstatic that she's finally returned with a brand new studio album, and it certainly lives up to the hype. 2017 was a year where I really started to appreciate more new music and listen to a whole lot of new projects, and Turn Out the Lights was definitely a highlight of that year for me, and to this day I still return to it. I mean, as frequently as someone who listens to as much new music as I do can. It's a fantastic project. It's lush, it's gorgeous, it's beautiful, it's dark, it's introspective, it's everything I really look for in a singer-songwriter project. And this album, while it's not a complete deviation, it definitely plays the same cards and it plays to Julien's strengths. It's just so well executed. It's just so gorgeous. It has some really grandiose and just fantastic and memorable moments. It definitely shouldn't be just grouped up with the other albums, and they shouldn't just be categorized as just more of the same. I think every project she's released just definitely has its own atmosphere and its own emotions and its own just story, and this album is no exception. It's definitely it's a unique entity in Julien's discography, and it's possibly her best project to date, in my opinion. There's moments on this album that are just so cathartic and just grandiose and memorable and fantastic that they just give me goosebumps. They give me the same kind of adrenaline rush I'd get listening to some sort of extreme death metal, except not because it's heavy, but because it's just that powerful. I love this project. It's incredible. It's definitely going to go down as one of my favorite albums of the year, and the long wait has definitely been worth it.
Yeah, my favorite tracks from Little Oblivions are Crying Wolf, Bloodshot, Zip Tie, Repeat, and Ringside. My least favorite track is Heatwave, and I gave this album a light 8.
My favorite tracks were Hardline, Heatwave, Faith Healer, Relative Fiction, Bloodshot, Ringside, Favor, Repeat, and Zip Tie. My least favorite tracks were Crying Wolf and Song in E, and I gave this album a strong 8 out of 10.
Alright, next we have our final album of the month. We have For Those That Wish to Exist by Architects. And this is the 9th studio album from the UK metalcore band. And I've only gotten into Architects recently, but I do really like some of their albums, in particular their 2016 album, All Our Gods Have Abandoned Us, which I fucking love the shit out of. I think it's a brilliant metalcore album. But, as a whole, I haven't heard everything the band have put out, and, this new album is coming out, so I was curious to see what Architects would do this time around. But I'm just going to be blunt here. I fucking hate this album. I really don't like this album. For Those That Wish to Exist sees the band, give into a lot of the generic and awful tropes that plague the modern metalcore sphere, and just make one of those records that I like to call, offensively inoffensive. How the fuck do you Imagine Dragons a metalcore album? What went wrong? Whose idea was this? Did they just start taking notes from bands like fucking Bring Me the Horizon and say, yeah, let's make something like this, but way more trite, shitty, and generic? If that's the case here, then good job, lads. And I feel bad saying this, because I like this band, but Jesus Christ. The band's previous albums had so much more to offer than the trite garbage we see on this album, and it just feels like such a massive step down from those albums for a number of reasons. Firstly, the production is awful. I hate the production on this album. It's just so... Just thinking about it makes my skin crawl. It's so overproduced and compressed to shit that it just borders on being unlistenable. It's so colourless. The guitars have just so much compression on them that they have little to no flavour. The drums lack punch and just come off incredibly sterile. And the performances are boring, and just all of these different dramatic sounds and scales they incorporate into the mixes sound so cheesy, extremely derivative and formulaic. Frontman Sam Carter's vocals are just not that great either, not only because the vocal processing is just really sloppy, but also because his melodic tendencies in choruses just fall flat for me, and they're just come off like really lifeless and void of personality, as well as his screams, which are just lame throughout this whole fucking album. They just lack so much drive and push that it's borderline insulting. The lyrics read like some "I'm 14 and this is deep" drivel, and this album is extremely one note. Like, I cannot distinguish between any of these songs because they just sound exactly the same. It's just so soulless, overproduced to crap, and it's 58 minutes long. Like, why? There's no need for an album like this to be as long as it is, and it's just such a fucking slog to sit through. Fucking hell. Like, I've never been as bored listening to a metalcore album before than I was listening to this, and I wish I just fucking skipped this. So, yeah, it's just shit. What more do I need to say?
Yeah, no, I'm completely with you. For me personally, there's no worse crime a metal album can commit than be boring. And rarely a second goes by while I'm listening to this project where I'm not bored out of my fucking mind. It is some of the most just derivative, generic, overly polished, and just weightless metal I've heard in a long time. There's just, I cannot even think of any, redeeming qualities to this project. It literally sounds like a poor man's Bring Me the Horizon, and I don't even like Bring Me the Horizon. It's just so fucking lifeless. The instrumentation is completely dead. The guitar work especially is just so fucking compressed and limp. All the riffs just do my head in. It's just completely loses touch with any of the metalcore, qualities that made their previous records. And I haven't heard any of their previous records, but I have heard songs, and they definitely, this is just night and day. This is the bottom of the barrel. I cannot believe that, a band who released some of their previous tracks have also released this fucking garbage. It is so boring and insignificant, and it plays to so many tropes that it's hard to listen to. It's really just a painful project to listen to. It's perhaps not the worst metal album I've ever heard, but it's just so boring and just so insignificant in almost every single way that I'd almost rather if this was just even more dog shit, just so at least I could have something to laugh about. There's nothing to laugh about here. It's just pain. Literally,
I heavily agree. You should check out their 2016 album. That's actually really good.
Yeah, I should. I've heard tracks. That's all.
Yeah. With that in mind, I only really liked one track from this album, and it's not even that good. Animals, and I hate everything else on this album, but the track run from An Ordinary Extinction to Little Wonder is especially horrid, and I gave this album a decent 2.
My favorite track, I agree, was Animals. I don't know what to do for least favorite tracks, because I listened to this, I was for the first time, fully expecting to listen to it again, and then take note of my least favorite tracks afterwards. But I only listened to this once. I don't want to sit through this again. Most of this album was just pain. So take that as you will.
Score?
Strong 2.
There we go. And yeah, with that in mind, we basically talked about all the albums that we wanted to talk about. And let's get right into our best, worst albums and our songs of the month. So, we'll start with the worst albums. My number 3 is Glowing in the Dark by Django.
I will just first of all mention that there's only one album in my worst albums that I dislike. There hasn't been any ass albums this month. And also when it comes to my favorite albums, there's a 6 out of 10 in there. So yeah, quite a mid-month overall. My number 3 pick was Pale Waves, Who Am I, which is a decent project overall.
Oh, fair. My number 2 is Who Am I by Pale Waves.
My number 2 is Foo Fighters' Medicine at Midnight.
And well, before I get to number 1, I actually want to mention one album, just as an honorable mention. We didn't cover it because I didn't want to add that in. Life Rolls On by Florida Georgia Line. Fucking terrible. Don't listen to it.
I'm not listening to that.
Yeah, Trey made me listen to it. It's so bad. My number one, though, For Those That Wish to Exist by Architects.
Yep, same here.
Yeah, we are in agreement. Let's go. Alright, now we're going to move on to our 5 best albums of the month. And for number 5, I chose Super Monster by Claud.
Number 5, I chose LW by King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard.
My number 4 is TYRON by Slowthai.
My number 4 is The Weather Station, Ignorance.
My number 3 is Carnage, Nick Cave and Warren Ellis.
My number 3 is Slowthai, TYRON.
My number 2 is Little Oblivions by Julien Baker.
My number 2 is also Little Oblivions by Julien Baker.
And my number 1 is For the First Time by Black Country New Road.
My number 1 is also For the First Time by Black Country New Road.
Hey, we're in agreement. Let's go. And we are on for our best songs of the month. And there's been a lot of songs that I absolutely adored this month. So I'm going to mention like a few honorable mentions. Midnight Flip by Mogwai, Albuquerque, Nick Cave and Warren Ellis. KGLW, King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. And I Try by Slowthai. But my song of the month is Track X, Black Country New Road.
Well, I want to give some honorable mentions to I Tried by Slowthai as well. To what's it called? Not Track. I forget the track's name.
Sunglasses.
It's Black Country New Road. It's not Sunglasses. It's
Athens, France.
Science Fair.
All right.
Black Country New Road. I want to give a shout out to Taylor Swift for her re-release of Love Story.
Yeah, actually, add that into mine too.
Yeah, I want to give a shout out to Julien Baker with Hardline. What else was there? There was another one. There definitely was another one. Hold up. I think it's one you actually mentioned. Oh, correct. King Gizzard and Lizard Wizard, KGLW. But my song of the month, which may be surprising considering I had this album in my bottom 3, is Pale Waves, Wish You Were Here.
Really? I thought that song was just
one
like
of the best pop rock songs I've heard in a long time.
God, I thought that song was just so there. Damn, that's surprising.
I fucking love it.
Fair enough. You love yourself some pop rock.
Yeah. Sometimes.
Yeah. Sometimes. When it's not completely ass.
I am quite the poptimist, but I do like to be cynical, so
I try to be as much of a poptimist as I can. And yeah, with that in mind, we did it. We talked about everything that we needed to talk about this month. And yeah. Thanks for checking out today's episode of the Taped Podcast. We hope that you enjoyed it. What were some of your favourite albums of the month? What were some of your least favourites? Give us your favourite songs of the month as well. As always, necessary links are going to be in the description to our own album of the year, Rate Your Music, and our own individual YouTube channels. And yeah, we have a pretty big month set for worst to bests. So I think I'll just announce the next week, what we're doing next week.
Yeah. We
are going to be doing a worst to best on King Crimson. So look out for that one. That's a pretty exciting one. And with that in mind, my name's been MickyT.
I'm Nostalgia.
See ya.
Bye.